Welcome to the Three Seeds Natives podcast, where we believe it takes 3 seeds to germinate great ideas.
Seeds 1 and 2 are Stephanie.
Hello, and Elizabeth.
Yo.
And seed 3 is a guest or even a plant with a story.
Let's dive into the curious and fascinating world of native plants.
We're so happy to be joined by Katie Kucera. She is an ecologist with the Wetlands initiative here in Illinois.
Welcome, Katie.
Hi, it's great to be here with you two.
So, Katie, can you give us, first of all, can you just tell us what is an ecologist?
With the Wetlands Initiative, and generally speaking, an ecologist, I think of my role as someone who sort of synthesizes primarily the work that we do with plants, but there's also components of understanding how those plants interact with animals and with the abiotic community. So thinking about moisture and soil types. So I think of an ecologist as someone who puts all of that information together. And in the context of my work with the Wetlands Initiative, I use that knowledge in applied ecological restoration.
Applied ecological restoration. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, so the Wetlands Initiative, we have a number of different wetland restoration projects. And yes, our title is the Wetlands Initiative, so our focus is on wetland restoration specifically. And across northern Illinois and northwest Indiana, we have done wetland restoration at the landscape scale. We do hemi-marsh restoration, and we also do tile treatment wetland installations at farm fields. And we also have done wet prairie restoration at places like Medewa National Tallgrass Prairie. So my role as an ecologist in applied ecological restoration for the Wetlands Initiative is I lead all of our plant procurement. I order our seeds and plugs when we were doing on-the-ground restoration. I also coordinate monitoring and doing plant surveys to make sure our restoration projects are successful. And I also do things like this. I do public and professional outreach about our work. Yeah.
Excellent.
You've got a lot on your plate.
Yeah.
Can I ask you for a definition of, you use the word tile?
Yeah, tile drain tiles.
And what are those?
Drain tiles are a ubiquitous form of infrastructure in the Midwest and in other regions. Drain tiles historically were made out of ceramic. Nowadays, I think they're mostly made out of plastic. But they are cylindrical tubes of tile. They're installed under the surface of the soil, and they drain water away from the surface to essentially remove water from the soil surface, usually in order to make agriculture easier.
So what's the goal? You're removing water from the surface so then you can irrigate, you can reuse that water for irrigation?
Generally in the Midwest, it's actually because the soils are holding too much water, which makes it too hard to farm. So yeah, using drain tiles is better, I think, for yield.
Okay.
Where does that water lead? Does it have pesticides in it?
Most often, yes, and a lot of fertilizers. Nitrogen runoff and surface runoff from agricultural fields is a major issue. That affects everything from, the giant Mississippi River, where many people have heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. But that starts with just drainage creeks and ditches that drain that water away from individual farm fields. And that accumulates into larger and larger rivers until it reaches the Mississippi River, essentially. But drain tiles are basically the first point of contact where that water is removed from the land and directed into, usually in the Midwest, something that just looks like a straight ditch.
Okay.
Yeah.
We and our ditches. Lots of ditches in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, could you also just give some background about what are wetlands, the role of wetlands? Are there, we know there are fewer wetlands than there were before, like a mini primer.
Yeah. Wetlands are ecosystems that hold water for a significant amount of time during the year. There are such things as ephemeral wetlands, There's ephemeral woodland pools or flatwoods that might only hold water after like a major rain or flood event. But those are also considered wetlands, especially if they are connected to a major body of water. And they most often have something like a hydric soil, which is usually a soil type that has a component like peat or something like that. A really important service that wetlands provide is the ability to hold water. So especially in drier seasons, wetlands typically have surface water for longer periods of time, and that's really important for animals to be able to access that resource during drier months. But on the other end of the spectrum, wetlands can also hold more water when we're receiving a lot of water, usually in the form of rain. But there are some wetlands that are groundwater fed, and those are also very important and usually stay wet year round.
Okay. How much of Illinois used to be wetlands?
So much. We like literally have a graphic that we just put together this year of like
We can share a link to it.
Yes,
Yeah.
I will send that to you.
Okay.
Yes, a very large portion. I want to say something close to like 2/3 of the state of Illinois has not hydric soil, but soil that has the water holding capacity to hold that much water for long enough in the year to be considered wet to some degree. And when I think about an example of that, I think about the natural divisions of Illinois, and a large part of our state is the Grand Prairie Natural Division, and it's part of what has been known as the Prairie Peninsula that kind of stretches from Iowa and Missouri through Illinois and Indiana and into Ohio, and it was a really, large, vast grassland that has since mostly been converted to agriculture. The natural area or the natural division description for the Grand Prairie mentions how frequently you would still encounter things like wet prairies and marshes scattered throughout that landscape. And you can still see landscapes like this sort of in the short grass biome as you get more into the western United States, which is a really important flyover ground for waterfowl and ducks and species like that who visit things called prairie potholes. Which are like isolated prairie wetlands. But we had many of those as well. We just turned most of them into corn and soy agriculture because we had the most fertile soils in Illinois. We had really deep black soil, topsoil prairies that covered a huge portion of the state.
That black soil was also like a result of the benefit of these wetlands being adjacent to them, or?
To some extent, yes. I mean, that soil was created over millennia from, plants growing and dying and decomposing, and also from humans managing the landscape with fire and returning those nutrients to the soil and returning carbon back to the soil. And it had this really, I think, as we think about restoration now, management tools like fire are really important for kind of restoring the soil structure that we've lost by compacting soils and farming soils.
Plant nerd question. The wetland restoration that you're doing now, are you using native plants that scientists have found to have existed for millennia?
Yes.
When you're talking about that like rich soil, is there any way to be able to identify what types of plants were in that soil makeup, or is it like too hard to tell?
I'm not sure if people have done that kind of research in the Midwest specifically, but there are people who study paleobotany and have been able to identify, like, talking millions of years ago,
okay.
like which sorts of species would have been present based on looking at the fossil record, but also looking at, I don't know the term exactly, but basically fossilized plants. I don't know the evolutionary history of every species that we use, but yes.
You don't? Oh my gosh, I'm so disappointed. I'm just kidding.
But yes, most of these plants have existed on this landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Something that has been certainly in the air of late is like the idea of resistance and resistance to changing times, really. Curious to know, when you think about wetlands and you think about also like the plants and even the wildlife that are attracted to them, like, can you kind of talk about this idea of wetlands as kind of a resistant ecosystem?
Yes, I think wetlands are so resistant. And thinking about, like different ends of the spectrum, wetlands resist drought by holding water and providing that resource for plants and wildlife in dry seasons. And on the other end of the spectrum, they resist times of high water by holding excess water and providing floodwater retention. Well, I'm thinking about beavers now. It's going to be hard to get away from that thought.
Oh, wow. I will then ask you about beavers later.
And thinking about the more extreme weather patterns that we're having as a result of living in a warming climate, wetlands have become an increasingly, maybe even more important type of habitat because of the functions that I just described, where they're able to hold water when we experience more severe droughts, which has, even in my recent memory, the past couple of years, we've had extreme droughts, both in the spring and in the late season in the fall, which, affects everything from plant germination early in the season to when plants are making seeds and how many seeds they're able to make at the end of the season. Yeah, so I think moving forward in the changing climate that we're all experiencing, that wetlands are a form of resistance to that. They're a buffer to all of the crazy weather that we're going to be experiencing and have started experiencing. And wetland wildlife have played a huge role in that and in forming wetlands on the landscape. And that's where I was thinking about beavers.
Here they come. Build me a dam.
Yeah, exactly. Beavers just know kind of exactly how to create the best wetlands on the landscape. They know where to build them so that they retain water, and they know where to build them so that they create habitat for other animals. I know that beavers have really close relationships with fish and, marsh birds and other wildlife that sort of depend on habitats that beavers create.
And they're doing this, well, this is a silly question and it has nothing to do with native plants, but beavers are doing this out of necessity and just an innate desire and knowledge base. Like they inherit the knowledge of how to find these areas and create these habitats, but they also need those. It's kind of
it's shelter, right?
Yeah, I mean, so
shelter,
beavers are
food.
Attracted to the sound of running water, and they do what they can to stop that sound of running water, essentially.
Oh, really?
And yeah, they have the right, teeth to gnaw down trees and essentially create dams. But as a result of creating those dams, wetland species, if they're present nearby, will grow in those created wetlands and provide habitat for nesting birds. If the beaver dam is connected to a stream or a fish passage, usually fish are actually adapted to beaver dams. There's a phrase, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but it's that beavers taught fish how to jump. So when
funny.
you think about, I guess, how fish travel through waterways, fish are adapted to beaver dams and know how to get around them.
Do you mean like to go back to their spawning sites and whatever?
Yeah, and they're actually invasive species that are introduced from places where beavers aren't. So beavers are also present on the European continent. I don't believe there are beavers in Asia or Africa, for example. So some of those species of fish, if they've been introduced to regions where beavers are present, actually don't know how to go through beaver dams or can't navigate around them. But many native species of fish in North America do. And so beavers create these really healthy, rich landscapes that are full of water, which is a resource that I think we all should respect more and be more grateful to have, especially fresh water.
Are native plants necessary to a healthy wetland?
So a wetland, I will say, will not be able to perform like its full suite of benefits if it is not composed almost entirely of native plants. If you have a wetland that is composed more or less entirely of introduced species like Phragmites or hybrid or narrow-leaved cattails, there are still ecosystem functions that those species can perform, like nutrient removal and like sediment filtration and things like that. But they may not be able to provide the habitat benefits to obviously other plants, but also animals and pollinators that depend on those plant species, and also unique types of plant and habitat structure. Like certain species of marsh birds prefer specific habitat structure that really, you know, like tall, dense stands of reeds don't provide, for example.
This is a dumb question. Do beavers eat plants?
They
do they like ingest them and digest them?
Yeah, I think beavers might also actually eat like small wetland crustaceans, but beavers and muskrats are known to consume like the tubers of things like cattails, for example.
Oh, okay.
So they're more tuber based. They're not really your top foliage
Yeah, right.
eaters.
Right. But you don't see them climbing up trees or anything.
Yeah.
So they're primarily pescatarian/vegetarian, except really tubers.
Yeah.
Don't they have those iron teeth, those orange iron teeth?
Yes, they do. Yeah.
I actually recently saw, I don't know where I saw this, but I saw like a little mini documentary about beaver habitats. And I mean, they're pretty spacious. Like,
yeah,
they can really hang out in there, and they
You're talking like a 5-bedroom, 3-bath.
Yeah, like probably like a 2-bedroom.
You know, and it stays warm year round.
Yes,
really?
because
they're like steaming in the winter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're
Really?
literally steaming.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes, because their
cool.
body temperature combined with like this dense insulation, you know, it's a mud hut essentially that they live in, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Oh, they mud it in.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. Beavers are much more, I guess I would say, like proficient habitat creators and builders of their own habitats than the species that I'm about to mention, which are muskrats. At the Wetlands Initiative, we sometimes have a fraught relationship with beavers because beavers are so industrious. And given the sort of urban context in which we work, it can actually be hard to work with beavers if they want to, for example, like build a dam that will flood an area that a road is going through. So that's somewhat of an issue.
You just walk up and just say, hey, and then you just slap them across the face.
Yeah.
You just,
Get out.
And they slap you with their tail.
Yeah.
Like, okay, can't win that.
There's definitely been like good development in like beaver deterrent technology, I feel like, over the past decade or so.
Which
I feel
is
like
the sound of running water?
there are people who are developing devices to like deter beavers, like somehow either block the sound of running water while be like, I don't know exactly how these tools work, but
Because it is hard to have a conversation with a beaver. That's why I was talking
Yeah.
about slapping them. You know, because they're out of their minds with construction. Like,
yeah. And if you're a land manager and you don't want to resort to getting rid of a beaver like lethally, these are tools that are more humane ways to deter beavers from building their dams in places where you don't want to build them. But yeah,
So you're
still
like
being
lure
able to-
them away to running
Another
water
place.
somewhere else.
Yes.
And the muskrats you were going to mention.
Yeah, but muskrats are a little bit different in how they interact with wetland habitat. Muskrats also build dens, but they tend not to harvest as many wetland species. Like once a beaver builds its dam, they might harvest like a large portion of, for example, like the cattails that are present in the wetland and create a more open water surface. But muskrats are not quite as industrious, like I said, and they will still sort of consume some of the cattail biomass that's like present in their wetland, but not to a degree that it's like clearing the cattails. The dens that muskrats build are actually really important for other wildlife, and there's a really cool researcher that I want to mention here, Leo Sawyers, who put out trail cameras at wetlands around the Chicago region at muskrat dens specifically. Sorry, I probably could have phrased that a little bit better. And Leo captured all these really cool images of everything from marsh birds to like turtles and even like coyotes kind of congregating around these cleared like micro open areas where a muskrat den was built. So they're a really interesting component of wetland systems in this region. And they're more common than beavers because of sort of the relationship I described that humans have with beavers and how beavers can be problematic. They're not able to create wetlands the way that beavers are. So we have more of them on the landscape in this region. And it turns out, yeah, they're like biodiversity hotspots for animals, which is pretty cool.
So cool.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Wait, why did they visit there?
I guess it's just because of the habitat structure. Like around a muskrat den, they'll usually keep like the immediate area around their den clear. Whereas like in a beaver wetland, much more of the area will be cleared. But like in a muskrat wetland, I guess it's just like animals are attracted to that opening for whatever reason.
But could it also be that the open area might be easier to cross or access, because I feel like sometimes the beaver
Or easier to see animals on a
wetland,
camera?
they're basically surrounded by water.
Or possibly
that
just like,
things can't
better
even get to them.
foraging. Yeah. Have to look into Leo's research.
Yeah, right.
Again, this is like more hot off the press research that's been conducted over the past few years.
Have you
published.
ever come across a muskrat, Elizabeth?
I don't think so. I feel like I have a visual in my head that they're kind of like low and long.
Yeah.
Have you?
Right.
I
have you
had
had
a
a
close
run-in?
call with one.
What are you talking about?
But I was in Canada. I was in like,
What do you mean by a close call? Because I've had
Vancouver
close
Island.
calls with animals.
well, it wasn't like bomb rushing me or anything, but I was in a kayak and it like slid off the land into the water and like went right past me.
Cute.
Oh, cool.
It was cute.
Yeah, I feel
Yeah.
like most rivers or like lagoon systems around here and in this region, muskrats will also like build into the banks of rivers and streams and wet areas. So that's a good place to look for them is along the banks.
Oh, yeah. I guess I'm just really curious if you could name some native plants that are really important to wetlands, I would like to know. what they are.
Yeah, the one that I was thinking about in anticipation of this conversation
But
were
not the reveal.
sedges. This is not my reveal. But sedges and broadly speaking, plants that are in the family Cyperaceae. So sedges, which are in the genus Carex, but also rushes in the genus Juncus, or species like spike rushes, the Eleocharis. We live in a region of the world that has very high sedge and rush diversity, which I think is a really cool thing about the plant life in this region, but also speaks to the diversity of wetland habitat types that you can find in this region of the world. In Illinois alone, I think we have more than 140 species of Carex. Botanists know this. If you're someone who's studied plants, sedges can be very hard to identify.
It's like
There's so many of
they're
them.
very similar looking.
They're very similar looking, and to maybe the untrained eye, they kind of just look like a short green stalk. They're not showy. They don't have colorful flowers. They're very important plants in wetland ecosystems, and there's different sedges that have affinities to different wetland habitat types, and I think they comprise a lot of the really important wetland native plant diversity that we have in our region.
So what role do they actually play in wetlands?
I would say they can do what any plant can do, in that they like consume nutrients and put out oxygen. I don't know that they have they just have adaptations that allow them to grow in wetter environments.
What are those adaptations? Just a few. I don't want you to get too deep, but what are some of the adaptations?
Is it also like their root structure works well for a wet
lower
habitat?
oxygen environments?
Okay.
I guess that's like what allows most wetland plants to be rooted in wetland soil. Like there's still oxygen present in the water column and in the soil, but it's lower oxygen than what you would be exposed to as a plant growing in dry soil and above the water. But there are plants across the spectrum, I would say, that grow in wetlands. Like some plants like to have, like to be more or less like fully submerged, like true aquatic plants. There are also plants that just like to quote unquote like have their feet wet, that grow in wetter soils. But if any of the vegetative part of the plant, not the roots, was like in water, then those plants would not be happy. All plants do have to consume nutrients just to continue, that's like their form of food, is like carbon dioxide, light, and nutrients from the soil. I would say that sedges, there are some rhizomatous sedges and some sedges that do not grow rhizomatously. In wetlands, I would say big plants like rhizomatous sedges, but also rhizomatous plants like cattails. We also do have a native Phragmites species that grows in our region, so that's good to know. I do tend to say that the rhizomatous plants maybe play a little bit of a stronger role in that nutrient filtration, just because they are composed of like more biomass.
Because their root systems are so dense.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's people who do wetland restoration who developed the concept of using warrior sedges, to combat introduced species, and many of the species that are referred to as these warrior sedges are rhizomatously spreading sedges. So they might not reproduce as well by seeds, but they spread really well using their rhizomes and runners. So they can be really helpful plants if you have an invasive species like reed canary grass growing in your wetland, and you want a native species that can stand up to that and be vigorous.
Yeah, so you're saying they're classifying the certain sedges as warrior sedges, but that's not the name. The
Correct.
common name of them.
Yeah, and it sounds like to be a warrior,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to go underground and make connections.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
Right. True.
Warrior resistance.
Yeah, it's a time of great networking for warrior sedges.
Yes.
And some of us as well.
And some other people too.
Ooh, I like that.
Let's go underground and network. Sounds great.
That's
So
great.
what are could you share some of the names of the warrior sedges?
Sedges have funny common names just because many of them are usually like Carex something. Yeah, I think a few of the warrior sedges are species like lake sedge, Carex lacustris. Yeah, I mean, if you look up warrior sedges, you will find those.
Awesome.
My role at the Wetlands Initiative, I am often very interested in purchasing sedges for our restoration projects, and because these warrior sedges in particular do not grow as well from seed, they're actually harder to find as plugs. They're usually a species that you have to like divide.
Transplant.
Yeah, so I haven't been able to like as fully implement that practice of like, you know, introducing warrior sedges to a site to have them spread to combat some introduced species. Yeah, that is something that I would like to see improve on the native plant market in some ways, having species like that be more readily available.
Yeah. It sounds like their current strategy is like divide and conquer, really.
Yes.
The warrior sedges. Yeah. Is that something, maybe we can take a lesson from that?
I don't know. Depends how much side you're on. Oh,
I would like to, I've mentioned this species maybe a couple of times, but the reveal will be a little bit more specific.
Okay.
But I can try to see if you can.
yeah, if you're
guess
ready,
it.
You're ready?
If you're ready-
Plant reveal.
then hit us.
Yeah.
This is a very useful wetland plant in many ways. It's been known as a food source, and it can also be used as a building or a craft material for things like weaving.
Oh.
Yes, grows by tubers.
So does that mean
Is that a burr sedge?
No.
Oh.
it is a cattail?
Yes.
Oh, it is. I was going to say a brush.
Because I know you were talking about thatching with cattail earlier.
So you're talking about the native cattail.
Yes, broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia. And I think I wanted to share this species because there's this one thing about it that is really fascinating to me, and I think is sort of a more recent discovery in the world of like native plant biology. Cattails are thought of as being a wind-pollinated species, but the native cattail specifically has pollen grains that are tetradic. So when you think about what like pollen grains would look like under a microscope, you might be thinking of looking at like single pollen grains that are, you know, like scattered around that microscope slide. And it's cool that the native broadleaf cattail has tetradic pollen grains, which are pollen grains that are basically like a mega pollen grain, like 4 pollen grains clumped together. An ecologist in the Chicago region, one of the co-authors of the Flora of the Chicago region, Laura Rarica Anker, she observed native bee species foraging these tetradic pollen clumps from the native broadleaf cattail, and it's one of the first times that people there's like very few other instances where people have documented that phenomenon. And I thought that was really cool because it's a ubiquitous species. I mean, like native broadleaf cattails was formerly very common. It's slowly being replaced by the introduced narrowleaf cattail, Typha angustifolia. It's hybridizing with that introduced species, which is not good. But it's really cool that in addition to all the wonderful ways that humans have used native broadleaf cattail over time, and in the way that it, you know, is like a very dominant species in wetlands, it turns out it also has this like
additional secret
really cool thing that it like provides for pollinators in wetlands and makes these like big juicy pollen grains. I enjoy the time of year when cattails are in their pollen stage because
Can you remind us when that is?
usually early in the season, I want to say in June, but you can just like go whack a cattail and there'll just be like, like dust plumes of like cattail pollen flying around.
Whack a cattail. Let's go do it.
I don't know. Then you're taking it from the bees.
Yeah.
True,
Right?
true.
I think there's plenty to go around. Humans have been known to harvest cattail pollen. It's supposed to have like a very nutty flavor. And
Oh, yeah?
Wow.
yeah, and I mean, like, in addition to people harvesting and making flour out of like cattail tubers and
Yeah.
cattail, like inside the cattail stalks, like most parts of cattail plants are edible.
That's so cool.
And it's
Wow.
cool that that's true for humans and animals, like, the animals we discussed, like beavers and muskrats, but also there are, little insect pollinators that can
Yeah.
enjoy a tasty cattail pollen treat, so.
And have
Wow.
you tasted a cattail?
I've tasted cattail pollen. The coolest thing I've done is I've never been able to collect enough of it to like make something
flour
big and
and-
like solely cattail flour, but I like to make fresh pasta, and so one time I put like, I don't know, it was like a quarter of a cup or so of
Could
like
you
cattail
taste a little
pollen.
difference?
I don't think I could.
You were trying to be
But it
objective.
did give it like a really nice, I made it without eggs, and like egg yolk gives pasta that nice like bright color, and I remember it had that like bright color from like the neon yellow of the cattail pollen.
Oh, wow. So cool.
So just
Very
make sure you're
cool.
getting your edible cattails from a clean wetland.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You don't know that might be radioactive. Yellow. Yeah.
Do you have favorite
I do.
wetlands for people to visit?
Favorite wetlands. Everyone, if you get a chance, should go to the Wetlands Initiative's Dixon Waterfowl Refuge, simply because I think a lot of people miss out on the experience of experiencing like large open landscapes. The Dixon Waterfowl Refuge is over 3,000 acres, and it is super inspiring to look out over a vast wetland complex of that size. And you can also kayak and fish on our lake system, and we do not allow trolling motor boats, so it tends to be very peaceful, and you can also experience wetland vegetation, which can make kayaking a little bit challenging, but it keeps you anchored, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
Are you able to fish even if you don't have a motorboat? I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, that's a good thing. I mean, like without the motors and people
Yes,
like
without motor, yeah.
But yes, you can fish however you are inclined to fish. I mean, there's obviously more serious fisher people who go out on the lakes who have like fishing boats, but you can fish without that. I don't know a lot about fish, but I do know that the lake system at the Dixon Waterfowl Refuge, Hennepin Hopper Lake, is one of the richest fisheries in the state of Illinois, and we have a few state record fish species that have been caught there, so it's good fishing, big fish, diverse species of fish. Yeah.
Amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah. We'll put the link. The links are in the summary, everybody.
Yeah.
Gosh, thank you so much for sharing all of this wet and wild and fascinating, fascinating information about wetlands.
It was a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like it's kind of rounding out some of our talk about Illinois habitat that we haven't touched on.
Definitely.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
glad.
Super interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right.